Good morning, Scottsville Church family. The main theme of Jesus' ministry was the kingdom of God. Jesus proclaimed the kingdom's availability to everyone, regardless of status, provided that they repented and trusted Jesus enough to do what he said. Jesus taught what the kingdom was like and demonstrated its presence through miracles. In his teaching about the kingdom, Jesus made extensive use of parables. We looked at the parable of the weeds and the wheat last time and learned that the kingdom Jesus inaugurated was not the kingdom that the Jews were expecting. They expected a king who would liberate them from Rome and restore the earthly kingdom of Israel. But Jesus' kingdom began in the hearts of people and would only be fully realized when Jesus returned. Today I want to look at two brief parables. I want to read from Luke's account of these parables because he provides an interesting context for them, first recording the healing of a woman who had suffered from a severely crooked spine for 18 years. Let's look first at the miracle. I'm reading from Luke chapter 13, verses 10 following. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. Like many of the women in the Bible, this woman isn't named. Instead, she is labeled as a woman who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. It's not necessary to assume that this implied demonic possession. The literal meaning of the Greek is a woman having a spirit of sickness or a spirit of weakness. The reference is probably to the general influence of Satan and sin in the world. For 18 years, she had been bent over double, unable to look at anyone face to face or get a clear view of her surroundings. As she moved around, people probably stared at her and talked about her, perhaps wondering what she had done to deserve her fate, because it was a common Jewish belief that painful experiences and afflictions were signs of God's judgments. Her illness not only stopped her from moving around normally, it also made her socially inferior. Such people are easily pushed to the margins of society. And so it might have been easier for her to keep out of the public gaze, but instead she went to the synagogue on the Sabbath to worship, and I think to seek healing from Jesus. Luke gives no indication that the Jewish authorities had arranged for her to come so that they could trap Jesus. The woman seems to have arrived suddenly on the Sabbath after Jesus had already started teaching. Here was a woman who was bound, who needed to be set free. After seeing her, Jesus didn't hesitate. He stopped teaching, called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." As we read, the woman straightened up and began praising God. But the ruler of the synagogue was outraged. He wanted to stick to the regulations. Jesus had broken one of the oral traditions formulated by rabbis to protect the sanctity of the Sabbath. The ruler of the synagogue was totally oblivious to the power and compassion of Jesus and his victory over Satan. But instead of tackling Jesus directly, he turned on the crowd. He kept telling them that they shouldn't come on the Sabbath, but on the other 6 days to be cured. The Sabbath service wasn't the place for this kind of thing. The synagogue ruler may have been warning the crowd not to behave like this in future, but Luke's words seem to me to imply that on that particular day, at least some people in the synagogue, including the woman, had come specifically to seek healing. If so, the woman was challenging a theology that thought that rules were more important than compassion, a theology that distorted God's intention for the Sabbath. As a woman and as a person with disabilities, she refused to accept this view of God, and Jesus agreed with her. Jesus spoke directly to the ruler of the synagogue and to others who shared his thinking. Jesus called them hypocrites. They had their priorities all wrong. They were prepared to untie their ox or their donkey on the Sabbath, but they didn't want the woman to be set free. Their possessions, their animals, were more important and valuable than she was. Jesus had a different take on the situation. In his eyes, this woman wasn't just someone on the margins. She was a daughter of Abraham, a member of the community of Israel, and included in God's covenant with Abraham. If an animal could be untied on the Sabbath, what better day was there on which to set free a daughter of Abraham bound by Satan for 18 long years? Jesus' opponents were shamed, but the entire crowd, all the ordinary people who were bent over under many heavy burdens, celebrated. Jesus then went on to tell 2 parables about the kingdom of God, and I'm reading from verses 18 to 21 of Luke chapter 13. Therefore, notice the therefore Jesus asked, "What is the kingdom of God like? What shall I compare it to? It is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his garden. It grew and became a tree, and the birds perched in its branches." Again he asked, "What shall I compare the kingdom of God to? It is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough." Luke gives the miracle even greater significance by using the word therefore to link it to the parable that follows. By doing this, Luke suggests that the kingdom of God grows from beginnings like the interaction between Jesus and the woman. By showing that compassion was more important than traditions and that people were more valuable than possessions, Jesus, through his actions and words, demonstrated what the kingdom of God was like. In the first parable, the kingdom of God is compared with a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in the garden. The mustard seed was the smallest seed known at that time, but it was a seed that germinated very quickly and grew very rapidly, but only to a height of about 2 to 4 meters. The parable recalls a passage in Daniel, chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar's mighty kingdom is compared to a huge tree that was about to be cut down. In Daniel chapter 4, verses 11 to 12, we read, "The tree grew large and strong, and its top touched the sky. It was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and on it was food for all. Under it the wild animals found shelter, and the birds lived in its branches. From it every creature was fed." And in Ezekiel chapter 17, God's messianic kingdom that is to be established was likened to a majestic cedar in which birds of every sort would nest and find shelter. Jesus no doubt had these passages in mind when he told the parable, but the kingdom he was establishing was different. Not a majestic cedar, but a mustard bush that was part of the everyday landscape and grew rapidly from small beginnings. But once it was there, the birds of the air, those for whom God himself cared, could come and feel at home, just like the woman whom Jesus healed. The parable of the yeast is also about the way the kingdom of God grows and spreads. In the parable, the yeast spreads through a huge amount of dough. 60 pounds amounts to about 27 kilograms. God's kingdom is powerful, but it grows from small beginnings and somewhat unobtrusively as the yeast works in the dough. Once again, this comparison is perhaps somewhat unusual, since yeast is used several times in the Bible as a symbol of evil or sin. That is not how it is used here, but again it is a somewhat unexpected and surprising comparison, and is perhaps another hint of the unexpected nature of God's kingdom. So what can we take from Luke's text? It's very tempting to think that God sees things the same way that we do, and to be blind and to miss out on God's purposes. It's easy for us to point fingers at the synagogue ruler if we are bound to the often unspoken rules and regulations that may exclude and marginalize others in our churches, or when we do nothing to lift the heavy burdens that are weighing others down. We need to examine ourselves and to reflect on the kind of community that our theology produces. If we have the wrong view of ourselves and of God and his kingdom, we may resent what God is doing in our midst instead of rejoicing. We need to be very sensitive and open to what God is doing in our midst. The second point that we can take away from these two parables is that God is growing his kingdom, and that it is possible for us to participate in God's kingdom right here and now. God's kingdom is not only for when we die. If by God's grace we put our trust in Jesus, if we spend time with him, and if with the help of the Spirit we live as his disciples, learning to do what he tells us to do, and learning to be like him, then we are participating in God's kingdom and helping to grow God's kingdom in some small way. The kingdom of God grows in ways that are not easily seen, and we may never know what impact a loving word or deed might have. So as we go out into this week, let us strive to be disciples who put our trust in Jesus.